No one wants another Pearl Harbor. This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world, especially those capable of massive surprise attack.
In the 1960s, during the Cold War, there was tremendous fear and distrust of America from Russia, and a lot of paranoia and fear inside America toward the Soviet Union. And I remember my father had gone to Russia on a foreign exchange. They sent some Russian engineers to Arizona, and GE sent some American engineers, and my dad was chosen. And then Gary Powers was shot down. And my dad stood in line with 3 other associates because they were putting his flight suit, helmet, and the remains of the U-2 for everybody in Russia to see what America did. And a couple of Russian military approached my dad, asked for his passport and his friend's passport, saw they were Americans. He pointed to the U-2 and said, "Look what your country is doing to us." And he repeated that several times, terribly angry, and then handed them back their passports. And that was the end of it. I never forgot that story.
I think what you did was plant the seed in your son's mind at an early age that this movie should be made.
That's right.
Moral decay weakens our resistance to the onslaught of the communist masters of deceit.
Every day, in one way or another, we were told, we were educated that there were bad guys on the other side of the world, hell-bent on destroying our way of life and making us live the same way they did. We had to live and be better human beings and stewards of the world because there was this anti-version of freedom that existed that was trying to take us over.
And may I say to America tonight that our nation may well die. Our nation may well die.
I found a footnote in a biography that I was reading about JFK, and it mentioned an American lawyer, James Donovan, who JFK had asked to go to Cuba to negotiate the release of 1,500 servicemen that had been caught and captured in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And I remember reading that thinking like, wow, why do you send an American lawyer to negotiate with Castro? Like, who was this guy? And I initially thought maybe that was the story that I could tell, you know, an American lawyer and Fidel Castro. But the more I dug around, the more I realized that actually the amazing story was what happened right before that, the thing that got James Donovan onto JFK's radar in the first place, which was him being asked to defend this Russian spy.
I was absolutely unaware that there was an accused Soviet spy, Rudolf Abel, who was the subject of a tremendous manhunt, and then an even larger prosecution. Okay, let's try one like that. I'm not going to go through the whole scene on this. Okay.
We're just static here.
And action.
Okay, here's the thing. The Soviet spy they caught, we want you to defend him. Here's the indictment.
The Bar Association asked James B. Donovan, one of the associate prosecutors at the Nuremberg war trials, if he would agree to defend Rudolf Abel.
What's the evidence look like?
Pretty overwhelming.
Great, great. Everyone will hate me, but at least I'll lose.
It was a very dangerous time to get into the headlines standing up for a spy, when if you even mentioned the Soviet Union in the wrong way, you could be accused of complicity.
Good morning, sir. My name is Jim Donovan.
This was soon after the Rosenbergs had been put to death for espionage. A crime such as that was punishable by death.
They wanted to build him up, like they'd caught this big fish. So they made out that he was the chief of all the spies in America, and that they'd busted the ring. But we don't really know that he ever passed anything like nuclear secrets or what the president ate for breakfast or something that would have really helped the Soviet people. We don't know a lot about him other than that he received and passed messages and funny little coins and things and had all these drop sites in New York.
The spycraft involved in that period in history is fascinating because it's stuff that really feeds directly into almost James Bond novels. You know, Ian Fleming was using a lot of that stuff. But actually, those things existed Those hollow coins, the way they communicated with each other, the silver dollar that they have to kill themselves if they get caught.
You scratch your skin anywhere, it's instantaneous.
Kind of fascinating to go back to a period in time where there were no mobile phones, there's no email. The ways you communicate are also handmade.
I have a mandate to serve you. Nobody else does. Quite frankly, everybody else has an interest in sending you to the electric chair.
All right.
Donovan was what you would call the stand-up kind of guy. That stands up for what he believes, which is justice for all.
Jim, this man is a Soviet spy.
Allegedly.
Come on, counselor.
James Donovan really tries to defend America's integrity in the justice system.
This man has to have due process, but let's not kid each other.
We set up rules to actually use them.
There was no search warrant for suspicion of criminal activity, so the search and the evidence that is the fruit of that search, that's all tainted and should not be admitted.
There are a few people, it would be nice if there were more, who are reminding us that these principles that were laid down at the beginning are not things that we can discard in times of crisis, but that the times of crisis are when we need them the most.
We're in a battle for civilization. This Russian spy came here to threaten our way of life.
It's all over our politics today about how do we negotiate the line between security and our principles. And you look back at this story from the 1960s, you see the same thing is going on.
The defendant will please rise.
He was in a very difficult position, and yet he had such dedication to the process of rule of law that he gave him the best defense he could, and a little better defense than everybody expected him to or wanted him to.
We know the search is tainted, and Fourth Amendment issues will always weigh more heavily in an appellate forum. We've got a good shot.
What the goddamn hell are you talking about?
If you look me in the eye and tell me we don't have grounds for an appeal, I'll drop it right now.
I'm not saying that. You know what I'm saying.
Tom is saying there's a cost to these things, Jim.
That's right.
To both the firm and your family. He had incredible foresight and set aside fear of the masses in your own country, your own backyard, and your own family, your wife, saying, this is too dangerous a job. And he says, no, it's too important for the bigger picture, for the future.
Everyone deserves a defense. Every person matters.
Jim, what do we deserve? Do you know how people will look at us? The family of a man trying to free a traitor?
I think the psychology of James Donovan's actions is the heart of it, the effect on an American family who really not been in this world before.
How did we do?
In there, not too good. This case consumed him. He felt as though he was fighting for a good guy, not a bad guy. I mean, he was also a good guy personally, but also he was a good guy for what he stood for, even though he was a courier and a spy, what have you. I make a motion to set aside these guilty verdicts against the weight of evidence.
Denied.
This takes a man who is willing to go deep, deep, deep into the nuts and bolts of the law. And that requires a very special kind of attention, energy, but also faith in the nuts and bolts of the law that he had. The Cold War is not just a phrase. It's not just a figure of speech. Truly, a battle is being fought between two competing views of the world.
You didn't have to live in New York to experience the Cold War. You know, we had a bomber base in Tucson, several hundred miles away from Phoenix, where I grew up. And we actually were a target. The Soviet Union had targeted with like a 50 megaton warhead Tucson. And we knew that Phoenix would be devastated if a hydrogen bomb hit Tucson.
If the bomb is 50 megatons, the blast wave goes out and out and out and melts everything from here to here.
No one was safe during that period of time.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
When the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, I was a teenager in Phoenix. I looked up into the sky one day, knowing this was on the news, that Kennedy and Khrushchev had come to the brink of nuclear holocaust. And I was, as a kid, aware of that. And I actually filled the bathtubs up with water.
What's going on in here?
Okay, Dad, this is really important. When the war begins, the first thing they do is cut off all the water and all the electricity.
I was sure this was the end. This was the beginning of the end.
Come in. tremendous fear guided a lot of our policy, not all of which was made known to the country.
It is imperative that these flights remain a secret and this equipment does not fall into enemy hands.
What about us?
I don't know if you're kidding, Lieutenant Powers. I'm not.
Francis Gary Powers was approached by the CIA to perform these top secret missions, and they were overflights, and they were going to fly over the Soviet Union, and we're going to be taking pictures of strategic points. They wanted to have as much intelligence as they could behind the Iron Curtain.
My father was born 1929, August 17th, in Pound, Virginia. He was raised there in the coal fields, went to college at Milligan College in Tennessee. His mom and dad wanted him to be a doctor. They wanted him to go to medical school because doctors made a very good living. But my father wanted to be a pilot. He had that passion, that drive to be a pilot. So against his father's wishes, he enlists in the Air Force in 1950. Between 1950 and 1955, he was flying F-84s, one of the earlier jet models after World War II, recruited by the CIA to fly the U-2 spy plane, flew the U-2s from 1955 to 1960 when he was shot down.
When the U-2 plane went down, it was a big scandal because we were not claiming to be watching them from the skies.
When we admitted publicly that the U-2 belonged to us and it was on a reconnaissance mission, we were doing something that in a modern world, that was the only way we could find out, get any information on a closed society.
Francis Gary Powers, на основании статьи 2 Закона СССР об уголовной ответственности за государственные преступления,
on criminal responsibility for state crimes.
The room alone made my job very easy that day. I was surrounded by 400 people who didn't speak my language. They had portraits of Khrushchev and of Lenin, and it was all very intimidating to me.
What you're reading is the actual transcript from the trial. That, what you said, what's on the paper is word for word what was said at the trial.
And I just kept remembering this man and how alone he probably felt. And at the same time, this undercurrent of pride that I am the face of a nation at this moment, that I need to keep strong, that I have to take whatever they're going to give me and represent the United States in the best way possible. And it was a very straining day for me. I remember being so tired at the end of that day, and I didn't speak a single word.
10 years of confinement with the first 3 years to be served in prison.
It was embarrassing to me and to the United States government, but I guess that we would have done the same thing if we had the opportunity. That's the way I look at it.
The experience did have an effect on him, a profound effect. He ended up going through 3 months of interrogations. No physical torture, but a lot of mental anguish.
Took my walks on top of this building. It was open on the roof, but with the high walls around it, and they were covered in tin, and some of the tin had rusted. And I had a spot there that a piece of tin was sticking out that I always thought that I could work off and make a knife out of to cut my wrist or something if things got really, too bad to stand.
Well, my father was determined not to spill his guts, not to tell him everything he knew. So for the next 3 months of interrogations, he does the following. He tells the full truth when he knows they can verify the information in the press. Helps to give him credibility. Lies to him outright when he knows there's no way they can find out the answer.
They got our guy, our spy pilot. We've got their guy. Prisoner exchange. I think that's what they're after.
I didn't know anything about the Abel Powers exchange. I knew about Gary Powers, but I didn't realize that something had happened subsequent to his capture, which was this very backroom exchange.
We want you to negotiate the swap, because you're a private citizen, so it's not governments talking.
So I act as a negotiator, representing...
You're not representing anybody. Not a government official. You have no official standing.
Our government avowed no connection to James Donovan. He was there on his own.
They might try to throw you a curveball, try and get you to accept another prisoner other than Powers.
Another American?
In the process, he discovered that an American student, Frederick Pryor, had also been incarcerated by the East Germans. And somehow he made that part of the exchange as well.
Forget this Ivy League boy who obviously thought it was a good idea to study Soviet economics in Berlin in the middle of the Cold War.
I cooked up a thesis topic on communist countries and went to Berlin because they have a very good library there, and I could interview people in Eastern Europe. And West Berlin was a perfectly safe place to be. I spent most of my time on my dissertation. My research work included a number of interviews of people in East Germany who were very cooperative. It was very easy to get there, and I had no difficulty in setting up appointments to talk to these people, because I wasn't asking about state secrets or anything. I was asking about how they conduct foreign trade. I was very careful on what I did and didn't do in East Berlin.
My name is Frederick Pryor. I'm an economics student. Wirtschaft student, see?
I knew I hadn't broken any laws, but that's not the way they saw it. They found a copy of my dissertation, and they immediately came to the conclusion that I was writing the report that would prepare a blockade of Eastern Europe. So within 2 hours, I went to Hohenschönhausen, that's the district, Untersuchungshaft, which means investigation prison, where I remained for half a year.
Frederick Pryor, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Matt Sharman wrote a script. He did a couple drafts. Stephen loved it. And then we brought in the Coen brothers, and they really brought Tom's personality into the story of James Donovan.
And between Matt Sharman and Joel Ethan Coen, I was in the hands of 3 wonderful storytellers.
I would like materials to draw with.
That's not possible.
Stephen wanted you to think about things. He wanted you to be involved in what was being said. And you hang on to what the bad guy is saying, but he's not really a bad guy.
Mr. Donovan, you have men like me doing the same for your country. If they were caught, I'm sure that you would wish them to be treated well.
One of the things I loved about this story was everybody you think should be wearing a black hat isn't necessarily wearing that hat, nor did they intend to. And so it sort of doesn't make it easy, especially when the film asks you to root for someone who is a spy against the national security of our nation. How could we possibly come out the other end of this experience caring about this person in the least? But in this case, we do. And that was a window for me to want to get involved in this.
And action. We want the man back before he cracks. And we want Powers back for the same reasons.
Where do they want this negotiation to take place?
East Berlin.
From my perspective, Berlin is one of the most fascinating cities on the planet Earth because it's a city of ghosts. You can go stand in an actual 3-dimensional spot on the planet Earth, and you're exactly where a bit of history went down. And sometimes it's a bit of history from 100 years ago, and sometimes it's a bit of history from 1936, and sometimes it's a bit of history from certainly 1961.
Yeah, the Soviet side, kind of like you started out, the Soviet side, and then you walk over. Okay, sure. Okay, good.
The Soviet side has been setting up checkpoints for the past 3 months to try to stop people hemorrhaging to the western sectors, and it hasn't worked.
We have intelligence to suggest that they may go one step further and wall off the entire eastern sector.
The Berlin Wall was a physical structure that divided the West from East. For me, growing up in Eastern Europe, the wall represented, the division of the world. Those who are free and not oppressed, and those who live under the communist Soviet regime. So if I have experienced, not necessarily the building of the wall, but I've experienced the life under the ideology of the Berlin Wall.
Papers, please. Ich bin student Frederick Pryor.
Student.
Yes.
It was a very hard time, and it was a very uncertain time when you never knew when the other shoe was going to drop.
Trucks arrived, soldiers got out, and they just started building a wall through the middle of a city. There was no warning. People didn't know what was happening. They just started to brick one city apart from the other.
There was a nervousness in the air, but there was a nervousness because no one knew what the United States was going to do. Were they going to take tanks and just mow down the wall, or what?
I was amazed at how much of the East and West it divided. But I was surprised that the wall didn't look like San Quentin or Alcatraz or some huge federal penitentiary. But the walls were easy to scale. You just didn't dare do it. Most of the walls were symbolic. There was a death line on both sides of the wall. If you got anywhere near the death line, if there was somebody with a high-powered rifle on either side, you could be shot.
Hey, bitte zurück in die Linie. Gehen Sie bitte zurück in die Reihe.
We had crew and we had people that were advising us who had been there when the wall was actually up.
I'm an American, and I came to Berlin first about just 2 weeks after the wall was built in 1961. I was living in the West, teaching at a school in the West, which had several students who had been stranded in the East, living with their parents, but no longer able to go to school. Other students had been in the West on vacation. They were stranded from their parents or from their families at home, but they could continue to go to school. And as an American, I was able to cross the border at will and was able to visit these families and tell them about their children who could no longer visit them. And this was a very emotional thing for the parents, of course, and the families, and also for me. And for me, it was always very gray and brown in East Berlin. And the situation at the border, crossing the border, I had no problems because I was an American with an American passport. But still, you felt very uncomfortable. You had no idea whether these policemen were going to invite you into a back room to interrogate you for whatever reason.
Bitte, stehen bleiben, das ist ein Befehl. In die Reihe. Was glauben Sie, wer Sie sind?
You could go into East Germany and do business, but in order to do that, you had to go through so many hoops and climb so many ladders and be at the mercy of so much just trying to make your life difficult. It ends up defining the quality of your life.
Listen, you go back in line and wait. Hear me?
That's our Friedrichstrasse checkpoint, where Donovan takes the train into East Berlin. This gets to one of our moments where the real Berlin isn't like the old Berlin anymore. So if you go to the actual Friedrichstrasse station, it's all modern, it's all built up, and it wasn't usable for us for period reasons. And so we had to create that moment elsewhere, and we ended up at an overpass of another station called Gleisdreieck, which is very nearby, actually. It's just a few stops away. But it was quiet and allowed us the ability to create this checkpoint area underneath these rusting train tracks, which has very much the feeling of the Friedrichstrasse that you see in the research photos.
It was interesting for us because one day we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall, and we were so elated that we got to this milestone. And the next day, we actually were shooting Tom Hanks trying to cross at a checkpoint to get across the Berlin Wall. And we thought how incredibly lucky we are to be doing this, but also how poignant.
Aufschließen bitte. Schnell bitte, zügig.
I think it's a pretty incredible moment for us to be here because it is such a huge moment in the history of the world becoming one. And for me, as somebody who grew up in Poland behind the wall, to come back years later in the time when the anniversary is being celebrated is enormously exciting.
There are parts of Berlin today that look like West Berlin in 1962, but there's actually no part of Berlin today that looks like East Berlin 1960, 61, 62. Much of the city was left the way it was at the end of World War II, which means parts of it were literally still bombed out, were shells of buildings. None of the city was uplifted. You can't find that in Berlin. And we looked everywhere, elsewhere in Germany, and finally found a place in Poland, in a wonderful city called Wrocław, in which there are 3 or 4 city streets that look very, very much like Berlin 1960. It's because this part of Poland was once part of Germany before borders were redrawn. So the architecture in some of the blocks here is actually German architecture, and some of the buildings haven't been touched since the war.
We're in Wrocław, Poland. We're on a street called Mirnicka Street, and it's this incredible street that looks like you see it today. We're supposed to be actually at the border, so we have West Berlin here, we have East Berlin here, and the wall's in the process of cutting the two halves of Berlin.
We built a lot of the wall. We built, probably a good 300 yards of the wall.
Right, that's your guys going on action, yeah? You ready, yeah? We're rolling, and background, and action, action, action!
It must have been a remarkable thing, and I think what Stephen really captured was the terror of that, but also the confusion, like, what is going on?
Do it again. You push him back. Yeah.
No, that's the only copy.
Yeah. Like that, exactly. Be careful, get him.
As a Pole, seeing Germans in uniforms with big German shepherds, you cannot help it, but you do have a reaction. Emotional reaction to those moments. So at the same time, we're looking at 300 people and we're adjusting hats and scarves and adjusting the balances of coldness because it wasn't really a cold day as we were shooting. So it's a perfect multitasking moment that blends in our technical requirements and emotional reactions to what's happening in front of you.
So all the guards from here up to the end, you can go to the bus now, yeah? The bus is on the left side. Please just go there. Just go. You said.
So with the big scenes, we start quite early. We started with a team assembling period costumes, finding the proper counts of really great period pieces, and then we start fitting weeks in advance. We fit 30, 40, 50 people a day, but those scenes, we love doing those scenes because it's really a fun moment where actually the weeks of fittings and assembling, it comes to life and you can see that picture being realized.
I wanted to make sure in the movie that we got in these iconic places, these iconic things that we think of when we think of Berlin in that period, and Checkpoint Charlie is one.
We created Checkpoint Charlie right here in Poland, and like all the sets, you feel as though you're living in that moment, in time, in history.
We needed this Checkpoint Charlie from both sides. We needed to see the view from the west with the U.S. Allied checkpoint, little white hut, and we also needed to see it from the east side looking back west. So that's kind of a tall order location-wise, and we were able to kind of just wedge it in the side of this square leading into a little funneled street where we found these buildings that really, really look like they're immediately after the war. And we have the west inside the streets looking back out, and the east in kind of the more open area looking back.
And cut, good. We've all been on the subway.
Now I'll just reach up and hold. That, and Tom look out the window, and that's the shot. At the end of the story, Donovan is on the train heading back to work. And we were shooting the scene in New York, and Tom said, "What am I supposed to be looking at out the window of this train?" And I said, "Brooklyn, freedom, America. You're back from East Berlin."
And I just thought of, well, if we just show kids climbing over a wall and they're just playing, that could reverberate back to, the other time we saw him and people got shot. And Stephen just said, "Great, we'll do that."
And that was all from Tom. And it's a wonderful coda at the end of our story.
I was trying to learn Russian, and I told my family that I was learning, and apparently one of the letters must have mentioned something to someone, and they assumed that since I was learning Russian, I planned to stay in Russia. So I don't know how this got started. But that upset me quite a bit because, well, there was too much anti-powers at the time anyway, and I didn't want it any worse than it was.
And light?
It was said in the newspapers that he had defected. He had landed the plane intact. he had spilled his guts and told the Soviets everything he knew, or that he hadn't followed orders and committed suicide.
That's great. Perfect. Great reaction. Great reaction, Austin. Cut. Brandon.
Well, these were part truths, rumors, speculations, some outright lies of the time. When my father returned home, he was shocked to discover that this was being said about him.
The entire time I was filming, I would think of Gary and put myself back in his shoes. And what he said was that I wasn't going back to jail that day. I was either going home or I was gonna jump off that bridge and try and get away. And that was it. He was not going back.
I knew I was going to be released, but I didn't know why I was sitting in the car. And I waited for about a half an hour. And that wait was fairly important, although I didn't know it, because Powers and Abel were supposed to be exchanged only after I was released. And the East Germans weren't particularly happy about releasing me. The Russians forced them. So they wanted to show the Russians that they had some power. So they delayed the exchange by a half an hour.
The bridge is really a conventional structure, but yet the bridge had to be visually a metaphor of the story. It's called Bridge of Spies. So you have to make the bridge to be a character of the movie. So I had the idea of maybe filming the wide shots of the bridge at the moment of the last daylight. You still light the bridge just as if this was at night, but you're using that existing light to create depth in the sky and see more of the sky reflected in the water, but also becomes bigger than life.
I'm going to get a reverse of this to show that Abel doesn't look at Powers, but Powers will look at Abel.
Yes.
So let me do this shot now on your back, and then it's a handoff. As you get to him, I start. I've never worked in Berlin before, you know, filming a movie. I never really worked there, except to do press, of course, for movies. And it was a great experience. Hey, Tom. Yeah. And toward the end of filming, when we were about to shoot on the Glienicke Bridge, Tom Hanks and I were invited to the Chancellery to meet Chancellor Merkel. So we had a wonderful hour with her. And then we invited her to the set, and she came that very same night and spent a couple of hours watching a shoot on the actual Glienicke Bridge where the exchange took place.
For me, it was super powerful to be standing on the bridge, the Glienicke Bridge. It says the Bridge of Spies as you walk up onto that bridge, and it was freezing cold.
Cold. The bridge was freezing. It was, but we were all in it together. And that was our last bit in Berlin, and what a way to go out.
I wouldn't do the dialogue on the walk. No. We'll do the long dialogue on a side dolly. Okay.
We all reacted to it. I don't think there was a single actor there or member of the crew that weren't taking into account the fact that this is where incredible history happened. And it had global, international repercussions. And to be there recreating it raises the stakes of what we're doing.
We're going to push it on a nice medium shot of Abel's reaction to seeing Donovan. And then we're going to dolly back with Abel and then turn into this configuration.
Have you arranged all this for me?
Well, let's see what this is before I take credit for it.
There was something almost divine about this moment, and I think the lighting in the movie raises it up as a moment. It might go right, it might go wrong, but it's a moment that is sort of given this historical weight and kind of beauty to it.
It's not a scene about, wow, everything was better and everyone understood each other and the world went on, it was a better place. It's triumphant only in that, you know, the two spies get to go home alive, but the rest of it's it's hedging its bet. There's something tragic about the fact that this all had to happen.
It was my favorite day on set because it felt like the culmination of everything that we had all worked so hard doing. We shot the movie in continuity for the most part, so it was the end of the movie. It was Tom Hanks' last day on the movie, and we had all gone through an incredible journey.
Bring all the actors up here. We're going to do some wild lines.
Thanks, Stephen. Oh, dear God. What a blast.
And we all knew in that day, in that moment, we shot actually all night, that we had created something special, and we were going to all walk away and be very proud of what we did.
This scene here is located at Beale Air Force Base in one of the old hangars from the Korean War era. There's a U-2 in here that they're filming. This is when the pilots that were recruited to fly the plane are being introduced to it for the first time.
10,000 pounds of thrust, maximum speed of 430 miles an hour. May not be quick, but at your cruising altitude of 70,000 feet, nothing will come close to you.
We were so happy to have the full cooperation of the DoD, and it allowed us to recreate what went on in the 50s and 60s with these U-2 planes flying, and really flying. I wasn't standing on a soundstage. I was actually standing at Beale Air Force Base watching a U-2 plane take off and realizing they put young men in these planes and sent them to foreign countries to surveil for the United States government.
Beale Air Force Base is the home of the U-2 spy plane, also known as the Dragon Lady. This is an actual U-2 plane. It was built in 1980. We can tell that by the tail number in the back. It says AF-80, and that gives us the year that it was actually built. It is being used as a stand-in or a static display for the U-2 that we will be featuring in this film.
This is all active, and
This is a working U-2.
This is working U-2. And these U-2s are taking off and landing from this base all the time.
The U-2 plane is still used in theater or in combat. They still fly missions every day. In what we're doing, as you know, that we've been in combat situations for the last 10 years now, and the U-2 is very much a part of that.
Should it become necessary to abandon the aircraft over Soviet territory, then there's a 2.5-pound explosive charge contained within the fuselage.
We wanted to be part of this film because the Air Force core values are service before self, excellence in all we do, and integrity first. And this film gave us a perfect opportunity to exemplify those core values.
Francis Gary Powers was really in awe of this new bird that he was going to fly, this jet glider. These were guys who just loved to be up in the air, whereas it might freak out anybody else that they were going to fly at 70,000 feet. This really got their blood just pumping, that they were going to not only break the altitude record, they were going to do it for hours, every day. And they were going to do it as a top secret mission.
We need a picture without
Let's
all
get a
this.
picture of this.
Yeah.
I had the great opportunity to communicate with Francis Gary Powers Jr. And he met us up at Beale Air Force Base. He plays one of the CIA agents, which I think is a wonderful homage to the man that made this story possible.
I'm in costume today. I am a CIA operative or a CIA contractor that is going to be in some of the scenes. And I'm deeply honored and very humbled to have been invited not only to be a consultant on this project, but also to be an extra in the film. It's going to be a great memory, and I'll be able to tell my grandkids about this and show them that, hey, there's your grandfather.
I knew, okay, I've got to get out, I've got the ejection seat, and I got to destroy the airplane. So I reach up and I put my hand on the switches, and I said, no, I better wait and see how I'm going to get out before I do this. Because I didn't want to actuate that thing and find out I couldn't get out, and then be blown up with the thing. And then I got to trying to get in position to bail out of the airplane, and I couldn't get in position. And I was immediately thrown halfway out of the airplane, so far out of it that the only thing that was holding me in was an oxygen hose that I'd forgotten to disconnect. And it was fastened to the airplane. If it hadn't been for the oxygen hose, I would have been thrown completely clear of the plane when I unloosened that thing, and this I didn't expect. And when I got out, then I got to thinking, well, I've got to get those destruct switches, but I couldn't get my hands back in the airplane. There's no way physically possible for me to crawl back into that thing because of these G-forces. And I was getting quite concerned because I didn't know how fast I was falling, how close to the ground I was, or how long that I had. And I have no idea how many seconds or minutes this whole process took.
And action!
The crash sequence, we filmed inside Tempelhof Airport on a large blue screen. Our wonderful special effects department had built this gigantic hydraulic arm with the cockpit on top.
Head straight into the lens and stay there for a few seconds. And back. And once again, straight into the lens for a few seconds.
They were able to take me up in the air, downwards, they could rotate me. It was like being on a roller coaster. It was so much fun. We had the helmet, and once you put that thing on, you don't hear much unless somebody's yelling right next to you. And so I had an earwig so Stephen could talk to me.
Good, more breathing. Fight it, fight it. Up to his eyes, up to his eyes. Keep the lights on him, Janusz. Good, bump it forward and back. And cut, very good. That's an isometric exercise if I've ever seen one, wow.
And the same guys who now make the suits for our astronauts made the suit for me in this film. It was tight as all could be. Going to the bathroom was touchy, so I felt like Powers, having to gauge when I was, going to use the facilities.
And it breaks in half. Just as it gets to the parachute, this side goes this way, and this side goes that way. And it just breaks like part of the Red Sea and goes on both sides of the parachute. That would be a really cool shot with debris coming out of this.
And Stephen, it must be such a thrill for him to see that moment come to life. It's an extremely powerful moment in the film because this man bled red, white, and blue. When he was approached by the CIA, he was ready to head over to the Soviet Union. A running theme is that one man can have an effect on the many. And I think that this was the driving force behind Powers. He never questioned why he was doing this. It was always, what can I do to serve my country?
I gave him nothing.
It doesn't matter what people think. You know what you did?
In his mind, he had done everything he was supposed to do. He didn't spill his guts. He didn't cooperate with the enemy. He didn't divulge any information that they didn't already know. But no one realized this until he was brought back home and debriefed. By that time, the misinformation was circulating around, and it still circulates around today. People today may not find that in 1998, there was a declassification conference that helped to set the record straight. That in 2000, here at Beale Air Force Base, my father was posthumously awarded with the POW Medal, the Distinguished Cross, and a special medal from the then director of the CIA, George Tenet, the Director's Medal, for extreme fidelity and courage in the line of duty.
Why don't I, while we're here, before we go up high and put some up there, let me just get a shot down here low of the guards' faces as they close the door on Austin.
To know that Steven Spielberg has taken an interest in this era, the Cold War era, and in particular the U-2 incident, is phenomenal. This will help the next generation or two or three to remember the Cold War, what my father did, what Donovan did, and who Rudolph Abel was. And that they'll be able to learn about the current war on terror by studying the Cold War and the links that they have between each other.
We are engaged in a war.